This PowerPoint will give you an overview of qualitative research. Qualitative research is an approach to understanding phenomenon within a particular context. It can be used to help develop and implement evidence-based practices, but it's really not intended to demonstrate any sort of causality or to explain or to answer questions about whether a practice is effective or evidence-based. So qualitative research is more about the exploration and explanation of a particular topic. There are some assumptions that differentiate qualitative and quantitative studies. First is the epistemological view, and this is that in qualitative research, researchers believe that there are different ways that participants' perspectives can be represented. So a participant may have a perspective about one setting or a different setting. They may have different views depending on their prior experiences or their background knowledge. Whereas in quantitative research, there's the belief that there is only one single objective reality, that what we have is what we get. The next is the context, and qualitative researchers believe that context is critical. Just like the background skills come into play with the epistemological views, context is everything. If you are in an urban versus suburban setting, or you've had one life experience over another, that's critical to understanding. Whereas quantitative researchers don't see context as such an important factor. Now, it's still important when we talk about generalization. So if you're doing some research in an urban versus suburban school and you want to understand whether or not a home to school program is beneficial to students' achievement, that does matter. But for the most part, if we're talking about reading interventions or math interventions, context doesn't play that big of a role. So quantitative research doesn't see context as that key factor. And then last is the researcher bias. Qualitative researchers own the bias, and they call it out, and they name it, and they explain that if you understand the researcher's bias, it helps you understand the results. Whereas in quantitative research, researcher bias is controlled statistically through measures that can be inputted into SPSS or whatever data program that you're using, so that you don't have any bias at all. So when we talk about the goals of qualitative research, first is to be descriptive or to explain something procedurally. So what is happening? Why is it happening? So you're trying to make sense of it. Next is to lead into some understanding of a group of individuals and maybe those who work with them. So if we're talking about students who are new to the country and this is their first year in a public school, how can we understand what their experiences are like learning the English language? Qualitative research also explores attitudes, opinions, beliefs. What do pre-service teachers think about their teacher prep programs? What do administrators see as the most important factor during professional developments? Those are all about attitudes and opinions. Then there's also the personal reactions to context and teaching strategies. So if you have a suburban school district and you have teachers who have only taught in urban settings, what is their reaction to being in that new setting? Qualitative research also describes settings and also talks about the impact of practices. So if we are doing something with an intervention and we are going to implement a new math intervention, I may want to look from a qualitative perspective. What is the impact of that practice on students? What do they think about the practice? Or what is the impact on teachers? How hard is it to implement it? Do they think it's useful? Do they see their time being used wisely? Do they find the program easy to use or difficult, or any of those types of questions? So all of those are reasons for using a qualitative approach versus a quantitative approach. In this slide, you can see an example of a qualitative research question. So First, you get the purpose. In the present study, researchers attempted to better understand the practices of beginning special education teachers who successfully engage students in continuous and intensive instruction. So you can see the words attempted to better understand. That's a key that we're going to be talking about qualitative research. So the questions there then lead into how do the teachers engage the students? So we would measure that through qualitative data collection. How do regular and general education teachers share information? So perhaps we're going to be looking at emails or lesson plans or coding conversations. And then last, how are the collaborative relationships built and maintained? Again, this is from a qualitative perspective. We're not doing any sort of data analysis. We're going to be taking anecdotal notes, looking at field notes, looking at documents that are pre-existing. In qualitative research, you have to ask yourself whether or not it's an inductive or deductive process. And by inductive and deductive process, I mean an inductive process, we're taking the reasoning from something specific to something general, and that's where we study individuals to develop theories, and we talked a little bit about this last week. And then deductive is we're taking the general to the specific. So we have a hunch about a phenomenon based on some experiences, and then we examine cases to document what we already know is most likely the case in terms of theories. Qualitative research takes a degree of creativity. I don't want you to think about storytelling creativity or creative writing creativity, but you have to have a sort of thinking skill that is needed in qualitative research that you don't need in quantitative research. Qualitative research takes a little bit of divergent thinking. You have to do a lot of really keen observations about patterns, and oftentimes the data can be ambiguous, so you have to really kind of weave your information together to get a big picture with qualitative research. The last piece of qualitative research is that researchers are the instrument. So that means that we, being you, being whoever's doing the research, is driving all the data collection. It's not like quantitative research where you hand somebody a survey or an intervention and then you tally up the numbers and plug them into the machine. Qualitative research, it's the researcher who is bringing the ideas together, who's developing themes, who's making those reflective conclusions, because there isn't a way to just kind of plug it in and do a data analysis on that information. So overall, qualitative research requires tearing apart and rebuilding all these abstract links. It requires synthesis, a little bit of creative insight, and you really have to change your lens to construct an interpretation and then document the process so that your findings are credible. This slide piggybacks off of the last in that qualitative research is a constantly evolving process. As the researcher, you have to be able to work with the data and change your frame of reference or your lens based on the information you're getting. So the purpose and questions may be evolving at times, but it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach. You can't go into this and think that you're going to study, teacher retention and you're going to answer these two questions and it's going to be the same no matter who you talk to, where you go in the country, what group of teachers it is. It's going to change. It's going to vary. So you have to be flexible and you have to realize that you're not going to be able to put your questions and purpose in a nice, neat little package and expect that all your data collection and analyses are also going to fit in that little box together. This is a large list of the different types of qualitative research. I'm not going to go through what each of these are, but if you see these in a research article, they are an indication that it could be qualitative research. I don't want you to think that if you see these words it automatically means qualitative, because sometimes you'll see these words being used, but maybe it's a mixed methods, or it's a quantitative study, but they're referencing a qualitative study. But just know these are all different types of qualitative research. Most likely in education, you're going to see case studies ethnographies, action research. You'll hear discussion of grounded theory. And then you'll see some conversation of content analysis as well. So those are the ones you'll see most often in educational research. So one example of the list that I just gave you that I said you'll see pretty frequently is a case study. And what a case study does is it examines a single case or a single unit and look at the phenomenon within that unit. So it could be just one person, it could be an entire classroom, it could be an entire school, or maybe it's an entire event such as students, pre-service teachers going into student teaching. So one example of a case study is the study that I've listed here by Master Pieri and her colleagues, where they were looking at 4 co-teaching pairs in a social studies and science classrooms. So their focus, that's their unit of study, is those pairs. And what they were looking at is how those pairs interacted together in their co-teaching experiences. So they used, for their data collection, the classroom activities, the interviews with both teachers, field notes, videotapes at the classrooms, and other artifacts like the lesson plans, emails, and that sort of thing. So this is an example of a case study. The next thing that you might see is something called grounded theory, and this is where the researcher is looking to develop or discover some sort of theory that helps them explain a phenomenon. So why do teachers choose elementary education versus secondary education in their pre-service or in their teacher prep programs? I don't have a hypothesis necessarily. I'm just trying to understand why it happens. So an example of that is the study by Weiss and Lloyd, where they were looking at the roles, the meanings. They were trying to explain the relationships between co-teachers. And so they did observations and interviews as well as looked at journal entries. So they were trying to develop some sort of theory of the roles of a general ed teacher and a special education teacher in elementary school settings. The last thing that you might see is something called an ethnography. And this really is an in-depth and extended research project where the researcher is looking at us as a group by immersing themselves in that group, whether the unit of analysis is the school, the community, the classroom, and they're looking to have some in-depth knowledge of that situation. So the example I gave you was the Harry Klinger and Hart study, and this was a 3-year study, and they looked at the process of placement of African American and Hispanic children in special education because they were trying to understand overrepresentation in special education. And so they started from the district level and finally worked their way all the way to the individual student. So they followed this process, and they just immersed themselves. They were in the county offices, they were in the front offices, they were in the schools, they were in the classrooms to figure out what was happening to better understand overrepresentation. In qualitative research, there's a number of data sources. One of the most common data sources you're going to see are interviews. There's different types of interviews. There's individual, there's focus groups. They're done by telephone or email. And the questions can be closed, structured, semi-structured, unstructured. So a closed-ended question would be a yes or no. A structured interview, you have very specific questions. You don't stray from those questions. You don't ask any other questions. A semi-structured interview, you have a general guideline of the questions. You may have some key words that you want to focus on, but you allow yourself to kind of ebb and flow as the interview moves on. And then unstructured, which is you kind of go in without a major plan or a list of questions, but you have a place to start and you're going to allow the interview to take shape from there. Other data sources that you may see in qualitative research are observations, and this could be observations where the participants are engaged with the researcher or they're not engaged with the researcher. They may happen on video, so in other words, the researcher may be engaged teaching the classroom, so they're videotaping the lesson and then they go back and watch it. Or the observations can be happening face-to-face where the researcher is actually taking notes as they're moving along, which is probably going to be a non-participatory type of observation because it's very hard to interact and take your